Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to welcome you to TEFAF Afternoons, which is an innovation for us to be able to have this beautiful room and have people here not only for TEFAF coffee talks in the morning, but for afternoon events as well. So my plug before I start is to say that please look at your brochure because there are lots of interesting things going on besides this one. And we'd be happy to invite you back for any and everything. The other thing I want to let you know, because I always forget, is my name. I am Linda Lees, the Director of Cultural Programming for TEFAF New York. And the second thing I tend to forget to tell you is that this event, like all of them, is live streamed. So it's live streaming now. You will be able to see it online on Facebook. And then it will be edited and put on the website. So if things come up in the conversation that you want to go back and refer to, you find it there. Also, if you want to recommend this conversation to someone else, because all of our conversations are stellar, you're able to do that as well. So I will one more thing I have to say, two more things. One is that we have a panelist who is delayed on a train from Brooklyn, which if you're a New Yorker, I'm sure surprises no one. But she will be here, Kim Jenkins. And I also have to give a shout out to Siddhartha Shah, who is filling in for Tim McCall, who became quite ill this weekend and was unable to be here. So it's wonderful that he was able to change his train schedule from returning to Peabody, Essex early to stay here with us. And so I'm very grateful to you for that, because he is an expert on the pearl earring, as you might be able to notice. So he, as I said to Melanie, walks the walk. So there you go. So I turn to Melanie Holcomb, who is our moderator and curator in the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I also want to make clear, as is in the brochure, that she is a curator of a major cross-departmental exhibition on jewelry, which will be opening on...
It opens to members of the Met at November 5th. So a week away, and to the public on the 12th.
And the title of that exhibition is Jewelry, the Body Transformed. So it is out of a conversation with Melanie way back when she was standing in the rain in Copenhagen, that the concept for this panel emerged. So I'm so delighted to present this wonderful panel discussion to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Linda. This is a bit of a fantasy for me, to be able to fulfilling a fantasy of mine, because in some ways the show I really wanted to do was on men in jewelry at the Met. It became clear to me in the course of working with my colleagues to organize that exhibition of about 230 objects from our collection that much of this jewelry was worn by men, and what the other surprise was that every time I mentioned to anybody that I was working on a show of jewelry from the Met's collection, no one thought we were talking about men at all. There was a very, very narrow definition in people's minds of what jewelry was or could be. So this is a show that I think that very much is about kind of pushing and pulling on the category of jewelry, and this talk this session is really letting us kind of go deeper into what that is. As Linda mentioned, we have a great set of panelists here today, or almost here. Kim will be here in a moment. Maya Nuku is my colleague at the Met, curator of oceanic art, and who has thought a long time about materiality and its links to cosmological aspects of oceanic art. I keep saying she is of all my colleagues that I've spoken with at the Met, she is the person who's expanded my mind the most about what jewelry is and does and can be. Siddhartha Shah, who has gamely said, and is somebody who should have been on this panel from the get-go, and I'm thrilled that he is here. He's recently joined the Peabody Essex Museum as a curator of Indian and South Asian art, and he's been thinking many years about jewelry and kingship in India, particularly within a colonial context. And Kim Jenkins, who's gonna make it, I know, I've been texting her from her seat on the subway. She is a lecturer of fashion history and theory at Parsons School of Design, and looks at politics, psychology, race, and gender, and how that shapes the way we fashion our identity. So great, smart people who've been thinking about these issues a lot. So, and I'm going to bring up Tim just because he's been something of a muse for me, and I have a slide in here in the hopes that he might suddenly get well and be able to come and join us. But I'd like to bring it up anyway, and it's going to be, I think, bring up one of the image that he wanted to talk about in a bit, because I think he's the ghost in the room, or that he's somebody we want to hear from, even if channeled through me. So we'll get started. I want to say we'll leave a few minutes at the end for you all to have questions, because I suspect this is a topic that will bring up new questions. I wanted to start with this image in part because it's the earliest that we have of the set of images that we're looking at, and also because he so nicely juxtaposed a binary that I want to see male and female, and I want to kind of just explore that a little bit and see kind of how that plays out as we're looking at two very glamorous, very bejeweled by any standard folks. So talk to me a little bit about why this picture.
There's so much to say about these two pictures. I will start by saying that I'm particularly interested in the way that ornament, Indian ornament, was used during the colonial period to effeminize Indian kings as a colonial tactic of domination. And pearls are very, very important in that, because we think of pearls with Queen Alexandra there wearing these ropes of pearls as that being such a feminine material. Pearls, almost exclusively, at least today, being worn by women. Whereas Indian kings would often wear pearls, like the Mughal Emperor Jahangir had this thing where the only people who could wear pearls at court were he and his sons. No other men were allowed to wear them. It's because of the connection that pearls have with semen, with virility. And that is its own kind of extended conversation we may or may not have going on. So to see the ways in which masculinity and kingship is being fashioned through pearls, and the way that the queen is wearing pearls, it creates this interesting conversation of everything you said: binaries, gender, domination, effeminization.
And pearls are so interesting. The exhibition actually has a little moment devoted to the pearl, precisely because they are the most ambiguous, or I would say the most embracing of all gemstones. There's a way in which they are, I would say, in a European sphere, are considered nowadays the most feminine of all gemstones. We've been playing about, is that even the right word for pearls, because they're so special. They have for us now an association of a kind of prim femininity, but in fact, historically, they have captured both the notion of purity and also of extreme sort of eroticism, and it's that kind of liquid feature that lets it go in all kinds of directions. Do you want to talk about that story that you were telling me just as we were coming in, speaking of the liquid aspects of
yes,
pearls?
Sure, and I'll make it really quick. But also I want to say that what you're talking about, the virginity, that kind of purity we associate with like a single strand of pearls. And you also think of like the flappers and this expression of sexual liberation also expressing itself through a knotted pearl necklace. That it, in both cases it represents something related to sexuality. So the story I was mentioning mentioning is, on the one hand, I'm talking about pearls as a masculine material in its South Asian context, but there is this story of, I believe it's King Charles II, who sends his courtier to marry the Princess of France by proxy for him because he can't go. And it's the first Duke of Buckingham who takes all these suits with him, some embroidered with diamonds, some with pearls, and when he meets the Queen of France, he wears a suit embroidered with pearls, and it seems it was intentionally made for the pearls to come off. So as he's walking in towards the Queen, pearls are spilling off of his body, and then he gets up there and he bows down, and all these pearls fall out. And then he turns back, walks out, and more pearls spill off of his body. And it's like the most memorable, spectacular entrance. And we cannot help but read that as a reference to the sexual relationship and the virility of the married couple, I would say, with all these pearls spilling as he's preparing to receive the princess.
So this brings me to this idea of, are there certain materials that we want to, when we're thinking about men and jewelry, are there certain materials that we want to connect that are seen to be as particularly masculine? And I think I want to turn to you, Maya, and we can talk about the images that we have, or if there are other kinds of places we might go where you could talk to me a little bit about materials, jewelry, and men in the Pacific.
Okay. Yeah, so I chose these wonderful portraits by Irving Penn, which are coming to the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection, and a selection of them were in that exhibition that we hosted at the museum last year. And when you talk about materiality, that's really key for anything relating to the way in which we think about enhancing the body. So men in the Pacific, and here we're looking at two Highlanders men, so Papua New Guinea, and they're from the Highlands region. The gentleman on the left is a tribesman from that Highland region, and on the right we've got an Ngari tribesman. So they're really, you can see he's actually got a human hair wig on the right, and he's wearing an accumulation of seeds and feathers and leaves, and they both have this okam, which is a strips of bamboo that's kind of hanging down. And on the left we see, of course, he's got this huge nose disc. So one of the things that you're aiming to do when you dress like this, and it is the men in the Highlands that adorn themselves like this, is to really show that you're channeling the ancestors. So ancestral spirits are really coming through you. And they do make their skin very kind of glossy by rubbing pig's grease over the skin, so it gets this kind of burnished quality. So in a sense, you're not really wearing jewelry, you're using the body as an armature to show that you're channeling this ancestral energy. And so really, we kind of like to think about the efficacy of this display. So it's actually a really sensual repertoire. It's not just in what we're looking at. Of course, this really challenges our ideas of beauty and aesthetics. But in fact, when these groups come together for a sing-sing up in the Highlands region, and they still continue to present themselves like this and gather, and there's this kind of competitive rivalry which is channeled in these kind of great gatherings of thousands of different clans and groups that come annually to Mount Hagen or Goroka to have this festival. It's really all about the song, the gesture, the dance, and how they look. So I think it was David Attenborough, when he went in the 70s to look at and film some of these sing-sings or gatherings, who said that it was like this kind of the deep swell of an ocean as these kind of headdresses and the shimmer of all these bodies were moving in unison. So in a way, that's what you're trying to achieve, this kind of unity. And so individuals have kind of an individual role to play in kind of achieving that. So it's a very different way of thinking about
That's
things.
why, you can see why she has taught me so much. And the Irving Penn thing I find very fascinating, because of course we think of Irving Penn as a high fashion photographer, and with a lot of his images in Vogue. Do you have any sense at all of where
this fits?
Yeah, how this fits in with?
Well, yeah, it's fascinating. He actually was intrigued to go in. These portraits were done in 1967 to 71, and they were first published in colour in the pages of Vogue. And there's always been a question about the kind of agency of the subjects in this image, or this suite of images. And to my mind, they really kind of hold their own. They're really looking at him. He did have this mobile studio that he moved through the region with. And so when they were at the Sing Sing, he kind of set up this little studio. And people came to him, and they really kind of wanted to come and have their portraits done. And they'd actually been doing this gathering, and the Sing Sing, as it's called, since the mid-50s. So, they're not as constructed, in a sense, as people have. There's always that kind of power dynamic that people are questioning, but they're really interesting. And then these were a reinterpretation of those color prints that were published in Vogue as platinum prints that he did in the mid-70s. They're great. I mean, I love them. They're really vivid and,
They're fantastic. I wanted to give Kim, we all saw, she made it, hooray. No, we are. Everyone understands the limitations of the MTA these days. We're so glad you're here, and I wanted to give you a minute to catch your breath, but we're right, we've begun with a discussion, Kim, about materials and certain kinds of, are there certain kinds of materials in jewelry that are linked to masculinity? And I'm wondering if this is a good moment to bring in Isaac Hayes.
I just pulled these images because during this era, he was just wearing a great deal of gold. And I remember growing up with these images, with having these records sitting around that my parents owned. And so I guess as far as talking about masculinity and gold, I'm not sure if I can draw an exact link to that or what this would have to do with masculinity, but the first thing I think about is just this sense of, at least during this era, African pride and kind of drawing upon the wearing of gold in these.
It's fantastic. And talk us through some of the things he's wearing.
Well, in this one, I thought this one was kind of subversive, the one on the right, because he's wearing all of these chains around him, which would be sort of this reclamation from slavery, just being enslaved and having chains, and how he's looking so sort of in control and, I don't know if I would say glamorous, but just very much in control of his body and how he's presenting himself.
And on the left, he's got this magnificent chain and then the epaulettes. Mm-hmm. Do you know where he's drawing those? We may not know. Do you want to?
I'm not certain.
Yeah.
But
what discourses he's pulling from?
I think my thoughts would be the same as I thought in general with just how he wears jewelry, and that having, at least during this era from a fashion history perspective, you have men showing a lot of skin and it's very body conscious, and so I don't see this to be any different in the case of him just sort of showing off his body and his muscles and kind of adorning himself. You have a great deal of sort of gender fluidity happening during this time, so I just find them to be very appealing images in how he's kind of drawing upon this sort of Pan-African perspective, and also just drawing attention to his body as this sort of very sensual icon. I'm now going to go take us to the question that I might have asked at the beginning, which is why in the face of this? We've just looked at three
splendid examples. But why is jewelry, at least in this world, at least the folks I've been chatting with, why is jewelry so often gendered female? And then this is a bit of speculation on our parts, but I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on why that is. And you kind of alluded to, even in your image, about it, an element of emasculation with the use of jewelry. What is that about? Where does that come from? And I'm ready to just jump in. Siddhartha's ready to.
I mean, I don't know if I can answer that, obviously, but one thing that comes to mind is these conflicting ideas of what ornament means. And in looking at 19th century ideas of it in England, ornament by a lot of people was thought of as decoration, something that's extra. And the thing is in the South Asian context, it might certainly be superficial in terms of on the surface, but it's deeply substantive. You can, there's talismanic properties of certain materials. You can tell what region somebody is from based on what they're wearing. So I think that some of it has to do with this perception of jewelry as being just decorative, and therefore that's aligned with like women's consumption habits or something. I don't really know, but I think that we have to consider that jewelry, like wedding rings, can be very significant.
I think so. I'm not quite sure when that turn happened. I mean, if we think about some of the things that Tim would be showing us, that image I just showed you from the Renaissance, it's absolutely clear in Western Europe that white men in the Renaissance were loaded with jewelry. That, in fact, is very much a signal of masculinity, and the whole idea of kind of luster and shine. There's that term, men, knights in shining armor. In that shine, which we kind of toss out there, actually was sort of the critical attribute of the knight, of the nobleman, and the idea of sort of lustrous jewelry, of splendid ornament, of fabrics that are kind of loaded with gold in their very threads, is a part of that kind of shining masculinity of an earlier moment. So that decorative turn, I think, has to have, that links up women in the decorative, has to have happened later. But
yeah, it's interesting because that hasn't really changed. There's this kind of fusion, in a way, it seems, earlier on, where cultures, across the globe seem to have been trying to capture that essence of shimmer. I mean, shimmer and luster and all of those words that you're using is really very appropriate for how we still describe men in the Pacific, and how turtle shell, or that bright, shell disc that he wears in his nose, or as a huge breastplate. There's a sense of permanence and durability, which of course in the Pacific is really key because everything is so ephemeral. Even the idea that you would dress yourself and display your power, your status, your networks, in enabling yourself to accumulate those kind of valued goods is something that you do, and then you kind of disaggregate that, and it goes back out into the community. So, and the leaves and the shell and less the shell, but the leaves and the seeds and those kind of plant fibers that you see, they kind of are left to deteriorate, and kind of the idea is that there's a kind of cyclical relationship. So you're constructing this personhood, and then you're kind of letting it go. So I think the kinna, as we call it, shell valuables, which are the golden pearl shell, pearl oyster shell, that's like the highest status material, let's say, in the highlands. Of course, it's been traded in because you're in this kind of mountainous interior of this huge island. So, those substances, materials that come in from the coast are really valuable. But I think that's, that it's that idea of something permanent that doesn't kind of drop away that's so important.
And is there an idea of sort of control over over valuables, over resources? Does that
Oh, yeah.
play in at all in this? Or I'm asking you, but I'm wondering in general about sort of what it means to possess these, to possess jewelry, to possess these materials.
Yeah, I mean those okam, that long strip of sticks, let's say, is literally a tally of the transactions of kin and shell valuables that individual has managed to raise. And so you're literally kind of wearing your wealth in that moment. And so that's why, to just pick up on your gender point, and then I'll pass it over, but it's a big men culture. So men acquire status, personhood, prestige by the ability to have these transactions. So women have important roles, but it's not them that display themselves necessarily in those moments. And I think it's a kind of, birds of paradise and other species in the region. It's the male that was the one that was the peacock in a way, that was the one that preened. So maybe it has a relationship way back in the past with that. And then, as you say, it just shifts in some cultures at a certain point.
Well, just in terms of the value thing, I think, I don't want to, I'm being cautious about what I'm saying, but I'm just going to say it. In a heterosexual marriage or an engagement, the man traditionally gives a diamond to the woman who wears it. Though she wears it, the diamond is a reference to the amount of money he makes and the amount of power and ability to possess that he has. So in that case, it's still about his connection to value, but then she is the wearer and the ornamented kind of object that displays it. So it then becomes a question of who's actually displaying the wealth.
I had an interesting conversation with someone who was the lead person at Sotheby's for jewelry sales there for many, many years, and she discussed how for many years, until quite recently, the person who did most of the buying of women's jewelry was, in fact, and the great collectors often of women's jewelry were men who would then give to women. So what we're even talking about when we talk about men and jewelry, there's it may be a different matter of who's buying it, who's making it, who's buying it, and who's wearing it, and it's all kind of something to be parsed. Let's talk a little bit about contemporary fashion, if we could. And I'm, I have to turn to you entirely. As a medievalist, I just stay still back in my in my world. But I know you wanted to talk about this designer a bit.
Yes, so this is a peer of mine. I studied in the MA Fashion Studies program at Parsons, and this was a classmate of mine who went on to become a designer. He has a bespoke menswear line in Brooklyn called Herman, which you see there, which is his name turned around, and then he changed the U in her to a V because he liked this sort of classical element there. But his name is Min Her. And in the years that I've known him, I think something that I found most intriguing about his style is he dresses as if he stepped right out of the 1930s or the 1940s. Sometimes he would walk with a cane, always walking down the street with a cigar and a bespoke suit and all of this jewelry. And so this image actually was in his Instagram account maybe a couple of months ago. So it was perfect actually for this conversation because he's just really trying to display for you here his style. If you go through his Instagram account for Herman, it's very strategic in showing his lifestyle, the books he reads, the cigars he smokes, the swatches from Italy, and just having just a handful of rings and a neck full of jewelry, and he'll wear both earrings.
And the watch too.
And the
right?
watch.
And the watch, because that brings up even a whole other point, which is that's something we're trying to bring out in the exhibition at the Met too. So what do we call jewelry anyway? Is some of the gendering of jewelry about kind of how we're ending up defining it in and of itself. We don't include watches in the exhibition, but I do have sort of elements of armor and other things that sort of take us, try to kind of push the limits of kind of what we think about as jewelry. And I always feel like this is one reason we don't always think about men wearing jewelry in some cases, because we don't want to call their accessories, whether it was a sword or a watch, or that somehow doesn't get the name jewelry attached to it.
Well, and oftentimes for that, in advertisements, maybe it's in Vogue, they'll call it a timepiece. So it just seems a little more technical.
Right, a timepiece.
And distanced from the gendered aspect of
right.
what was fashion, quote unquote.
Yes, so interesting. It's a technical and kind of it's something made and technical in quality.
Technical,
yeah.
it's some sort of tool that a man must use.
A tool.
Anything that we can use to sort of distance ourselves from the, quote unquote, frivolity or femininity that is fashion, presumed to be fashion.
It's like that functional, I was saying ornament is just excessive in decoration versus, oh no, this is a functional machine that I'm wearing. It's a functional necessity.
Right.
Yeah.
But are we entering a new era, do you think, where this fluidity is going to cross over a bit more? And people, I think it's happening, isn't it? Where men are empowered to not feel feminine when they're wearing jewelry.
Yeah, well, we'll go back to the 70s, right, in that way, too. I'll let you respond, but then I can talk a little bit about kind of responses. The press calls to me on a regular basis as I'm organizing this show. So go ahead and, do you think I think we're heading into a moment where men's jewelry is becoming something
less stigmatized, I guess, now? I would say so. I guess it depends on what region you're speaking about. So I teach fashion history and theory, oftentimes from the Western perspective, but I'm working on sort of decentralizing that right now, which is a whole other conversation. So it's difficult to answer because if we think about the broad range of how men wear jewelry in different demographics, I think of like hip hop culture in the 1980s and 90s, where it's a very different style than what you were seeing on the runways or what men are wearing in Europe. So it's hard to pinpoint because you might have some men, like during that era, this bling era, as they called it in the late 90s, who said, well, I've been doing that. You guys are just catching up. So, but we are seeing a little more fluidity. I did an event a couple of months ago with my colleague Jonathan Square, who teaches at Harvard, and together we put on these talks called Fashion and Justice about how clothing and adornment can be used as a tool for self-determination and empowerment. And so we did one of our workshops at the Fluid Project, which is in Soho, and the Fluid Project, spelled with a PH, touts itself as the world's first gender-free store. So they want to sort of obscure this line of demarcation between what is feminine, what is masculine. So they deal with some of this too when it comes to the makeup they sell. It's for men and for women. The fragrances that they have are all gender neutral. So
and are they selling jewelry?
I think they might have some jewelry. Yes,
yeah.
Actually they do.
Yeah.
So we're seeing it become more commercial. That it's a whole store in Soho that you can walk into and not even think about a gender binary.
I've gotten so many calls from the press. It's as if it's sort of people have awakened to this. I can't say what prompts it, but both European and American press wanting to talk to me about men and jewelry. And this is again not because the exhibition specifically brings up men and jewelry, but they're kind of they're wanting a context for it because it seems to be kind of in the air. And of course, what I always say to them is, well, men have always been wearing jewelry. There's nothing really new that's happening here. I think it's a little bit about sort of where we're actually seeing jewelry appear, and it's sort of the fine, so-called fine jewelry versus jewelry in other places and in other spaces. So,
I would also say that though there might be this kind of democratizing of jewelry happening, where it's crossing over towards men, I've also become aware of more and more kind of hyper-masculine expressions happening at the same time. So it's not that like everybody's kind of neutralizing. There's also like this like getting bigger muscles, like having a bigger beard, like doing all, like there's, yeah, that it's like there's all kind, which is also a form of like peacocking. Actually, is to like flaunt your facial hair and your muscles.
Well,
But
I agree. It depends on what region you're talking about or what subculture, because I'm seeing that also, depending on where you go and where you see it. Especially like it's almost become a parody now of like Williamsburg, with just this sort of lumberjack style of just very authentic, masculine look, full head of hair and a beard, and maybe wearing your denim and just some sort of dress maybe that harks back to the late 19th century of this kind of functional dress. So if there is any jewelry being worn, it's not going to be too
pearl earrings.
Right, too delicate.
Right, it's not delicate. You got the
Because
gauge
anything
ears.
delicate would go against or
Yeah.
betray this idea of just rugged masculinity.
So it's different tribes identifying themselves. And that's, in a sense, what fashion is. I mean, the innovation, the innovative quality. If this is where the pendulum's going, then people are going to kind of push against that and do this. But I think now it's such a kind of granular fashion
Very
scene
much so.
that, there's so much going on everywhere. Like, you can't pinpoint it. Depends where you are. I guess you have to take each... like you say, region, or city even, or borough in a city. It's all bubbling up, but I mean, it's a very complex landscape. But I mean, people have always wanted to innovate. I mean, that kind of competitive rivalry, was going on with the way that individual Highlanders, interpret a kind of template. Ethnographers were always like, oh yeah, but don't you just wear this, this, and this? And then they were seeing these kind of very dynamic innovations, it's like things that are being imported into the region suddenly find their way into what are kind of traditional things. And so, that's that kind of great fashion moment in the Pacific where you have kind of, the fusion of, or people call it hybridity, but I mean, in a way, it's just wanting to push it further.
Well, and that idea of innovating or bringing in something outside of the region, using it as a marker of distinction, which I talk about a great deal with my students when we talk about clothing and adornment as markers of distinction, to show how much wealth you have, or maybe social or cultural capital, what you know, and then as soon as it becomes adopted, it's no longer novel, and then you've got to move on to something else to wear to distinguish yourself. But also with that said, you also have sort of like what we were talking about, this rugged masculinity, a distancing from fashion, and this goes across for both genders, I see, this distancing from kind of quote-unquote fashion and an embracing of style or a sense of authenticity, maybe uniformity, something that you can hold on to that is not ever changing like the ceaseless cycle of fashion, something that isn't as frivolous, something that has some sort of personal significance, a sense of nostalgia. Maybe it's a piece of jewelry that your grandmother handed down to you, or for a man, he says, oh, there's a story connected to it. Oh, I found it at this vintage store, and it was from 1910, So I do see this desire also sweeping through of just a desire, and this could be almost so social and psychological, this need in times like this for something that's more stable and true and authentic, the safest place in finding the safest place in the things that you wear and having some sort of connection to it.
Maybe it finds its way onto the street now as well in a city like this where, I'm thinking as you're talking about Pierre Bourdieu and habitus and how people kind of, what is taste and how people used to kind of decorate their homes. And actually maybe there are generations now you kind of take that and, you just kind of represent yourself on the street. You don't really have people back to your house because you live in a small apartment. It's like a democratization in a way, but I think you're kind of like wearing all those ideas about social status and currency and how current you are, yeah.
So, well, I mean, there's really two things I want to pull out of what you all are saying. One of them is certainly this idea of jewelry seeming somehow to defy our mortality, right? There is a kind of, there's a way in which the permanence is a thing that is, and I think, in many ways distinguishes jewelry from, say, clothing as a form of adornment, right? That is a thing that often, it's a theme that came up again and again in the course of organizing this exhibition. And even if it's an illusion of permanence, it's somehow tapping into that.
You know, and this was just coming up as both of you were speaking. While it has a permanent quality, I was just thinking about how my mother and my grandmother, there's such a legacy of reconstituting jewelry that you have,
Yes.
of melting the metal
Yes.
down, like reusing the stones. So there's both permanence as well as this like versatility and like impermanence to it.
Right. Well, and gold is the perfect material for that very reason, because it's incorruptible, it lasts, but it can be remade again and again and again, and so it just gold to me is one of the kind of those great symbols of permanence and sort of immortality in a sense, if I want to push it, push it that far. I'm also thinking about these notions of distinction, and if I were to ask you what kinds of masculinity jewelry expresses or enables, what are the forms of distinction, of masculine distinction that jewelry makes? How might you respond? What are we, and from the material that you know well, or if you want to venture into materials you know less well? I'm just curious about kind of what sorts of masculinity can jewelry express.
Well, in the Pacific, in those examples I showed, it would be vigor, charged male vigor, virility, your ability to, control networks and kind of organize yourself against enemies. So you're a good warrior, you're a good chief, you're a good, that's the kind of what you're aiming for in a way. That's how you would rise to that status. Yeah.
I think for sure there's like tiger claw jewelry, and that's a similar kind of vigor that's being conveyed. But also I think about the light and color shifting properties, like iridescent peacock feathers or quetzal feathers being used on the royal body, and that the divine body and the king's body, it kind of gets conflated sometimes in the South Asian context, where the more armor of shining color, light shifting effects you convey, it's a supernatural kind of body. Mm.
Yeah. And then for me, and again, I speak more broadly, since I talk about with my students the sociological aspects of fashion and fashion history, but one example I was thinking of, a friend of mine over the summer was kind of explaining all of the jewelry that he wears and how he never takes it off. And when it got me thinking about masculinity and how he's very adamant about expressing it in certain ways. And so one of them was a dog tag. And so there was something that just seemed so masculine about having a dog tag with this sort of militaristic, connection to it. And for some men who are actually doing service during wartime and wearing these things, it's a signifier for sure. It has memory to it, and then it just functions as an identifier. So that was just one thing that immediately stood out to me, and just thinking of this, masculine jewelry.
Well, and that link between sort of military and the military orders, I mean, that has also a long history. There's the whole, again, I'm thinking again of things that are in the exhibition, but which is clearly on my mind, we have these fraternal collars that are really about, no one is actually fighting, but they are military orders, so they are exactly bringing up the warrior is kind of remains the kind of quintessential form of masculinity. We have about 10 minutes, and I want to open up the floor for questions. We can come back to questions we might have for one another, but if there, I want to make sure there's time here, and I see hands going up. And I want to say that normally, I would call on the women first, because I always, but in this one, I actually am very eager to hear the men speak. So may I go ahead, you right here in the front. Mm-hmm. Oh, we got a mic coming.
Well, I don't know whether this is a particularly masculine comment, but
No, we're not.
the category that I didn't hear reference was age, and how jewelry is connected to age. Now, I think there is or has been a real both gender distinction and also time change effect. For women, classically, and maybe it's my generation that remembers that there was an age that a woman could wear diamonds. And in a way that was referring the fading of the physical glory and then the, the next stage of adornment. So there is the age question for women. For men, I think to this day, however fluid now this category of ornament may be, it seems to be only young men, even to this day, who are embracing the concept of jewelry as an extension of self. I think we can make some exception for gay men, but I'm not so sure even there where it still isn't linked to youth. And so the reverse, and an old man wearing jewelry, I have a ring on, but basically it seems to be extremely uncommon. It could be argued it's uncommon in fashion even to see such people. So just age as another category of discussion.
That's great. Comments, anybody? I think you're completely right. Kim, you want to?
I would just agree. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I do talk about age and dress and adornment with my students as well. It's important that you note that. And also, from a fashion history perspective, talking about occasion and jewelry, I have to admit, when I was getting ready today, I was looking twice at my brooch and just wondering if it's appropriate, because times have changed, but there was a time where you just think you don't wear something that, sparkly or shiny during the daytime. That's inappropriate. Or, there's a certain time and a place to wear costume jewelry and then to bring out the fine jewelry. Just much like silverware and plateware, there's just a time and a place for these things. So I don't have an actual answer, I guess, but to agree with you in that way, and that it's got me thinking about now how we've kind of loosened these norms when it comes to when to wear something, what time of day, and when it comes to materiality.
But maybe not what time of life.
Yeah. Hi.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Kimberly, I just wanted to thank you all for a wonderful discussion. The panel discussion is fantastic. So many interesting ideas, including gender fluidity, which seems to be the first phrase on everybody's lips today. But I thought those Isaac Hayes pictures were really interesting. But you used the word bling later on. Now, if you're looking at those Isaac Hayes images, we're talking about a period of very gender fluid, glitter rock kind of dressing. We're talking about Parliament Funkadelic. We're talking about the Cleopatra Jones movies. So there was the blaxploitation movies and this and that was going on at the time. So there was a real sort of flowering, I guess you could say, in terms of fashion and whatever. So wouldn't you say that the gold there is much more about wealth and status and power and being able to, say, come out of the ghetto and reach this kind of power? Don't you think it's also bling? Is it a different bling to the hip hops?
I would agree with bling descending from that. I completely agree with you. When I use bling, though, in the sort of late 90s sense is when that term actually sort of came out, because the jewelry was just so ostentatious. It was just this really diamond-crusted, if it was real diamonds, this diamond-crusted watch and the rings and the jewelry, just so much layering and less editing than you see Mr. Hayes doing here. So I do agree with you in that the sentiment is quite similar. But when I use the word bling, I'm referring to this sort of genre of men's fashion. Yeah, when it's just really over the top and just blinging and shining, but very excessive, much like we saw in some aspects of the 1970s, but a different iteration.
With Mayweather now, with his multi-chateau and his vineyards and everything.
Yes, with certain athletes and, absolutely.
I just have to just say Sun Ra and his orchestra. I mean, it's like they're trying to be, you know, you've brought that up. I thought Parliament Funk when you showed that image on the left. And I went over the summer to see that film at the Lincoln Center again, and it is incredible. I mean, the kind of link with pharaohs and Egypt. I mean, it's a kind of
It just seems a little more, kind of like what you're talking about with the iridescence, though. I still see a little bit of a difference where it's otherworldly. Because when I was looking at Parliament Funkadelic style, it was very much otherworldly than the bling era, which is just like, look how much money I have. Look, you know, all attention on me.
And I'd just like to also say with that one of my favorite works of art historical writing is Krista Thompson's The Sound of Light, which is about bling and the hip-hop movement and how it relates to Black identity. And I mean, I know she has a book called Shine as well that addresses some of this. I love her scholarship.
Yeah,
So
I agree. And could I, while we're just before, I think this, I don't want us to skip over this idea about kind of this otherworldliness and the relationship between jewelry and divinity, which is so deep and goes back such a long way. And it really is, in so many cultures, it's the gods who wear jewelry, and then it goes from there. So it's that affiliation that is really important, and I might go so far to say is, if you think about the gods in a gendered way, then that gets expressed too in the jewelry that's getting worn by humans, mere humans. Go ahead.
You've shown some examples of men using jewelry as a symbol of power, wealth, that form of transformation. When did it actually become that jewelry was associated with women, and how did that actually evolve?
Well, I will tell you this, we have some great jewelry in the exhibition for a woman from 2500 BCE, so pretty long time ago. So I don't know, I don't want to in any way claim that women never wore jewelry. We always have to kind of get into the specifics of time and place to think about kind of how jewelry is functioning. That's from that's in Mesopotamia, where the men are wearing jewelry too. But I think sometimes, and there too, you see gender distinctions being played out through jewelry. They're not wearing the same kind of jewelry at all. It's a very different look for men and women. They both might be wearing earrings, but they look different. The whole ensemble looks different. So you know, it would be hard. I think women have always worn jewelry, but it's about kind of to what extent is jewelry being used as a gender marker. Question? Yes.
My question is about if you think of the same piece of jewelry, like a pinky ring, and in the context of like an Oscar Wilde versus J.P. Morgan, one is sort of flamboyant and one is sort of power. So, like, how does that sort of come out to any of you? Especially flamboyant.
Somebody want to go? Anybody want to jump into the multivalence of even a single piece of jewelry? Yeah, go ahead, Maya.
Well, I guess it's just never fixed. That's the joy of trying to interpret these works and kind of the work you've been doing, I think, isn't it? It's for the show that's going to open next week. It's so garners or demands that you look with each culture through time and space. I mean, it's in the interpretation culturally and politically and socially, and so fluid.
Yeah, I would agree exactly that it's not fixed, but I do think that sometimes a pinky ring on Oscar Wilde would be used as evidence of his flamboyance, whereas it would not even be viewed that way on somebody else. It would support a projection.
Yeah. Oh, here we have somebody in the back, and then we'll.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Okay. I have a question. Well, it's an observation I've made kind of recently, where I've seen men. This is a kind of just an interesting thing that I've seen men who are now wearing jewelry that was made for women. And they wear it in a very different way, and the impact, makes a very different impact, but it changes the dynamic of not only the jewelry, but of, the entire presentation. I mean, your reaction to seeing this on a lapel or a jacket.
So, do you have an example?
Yeah.
I'd love
How
to.
is it more?
Do I have an example?
Yeah.
Well, okay. So a lot of, I know a little bit about modernist jewelry. So I've seen a lot of collectors of, modernist jewelry who are male, who wear these things that were originally made for women. I mean, that's the best example.
Like brooches or like a necklace?
Brooches, earrings, rings, but mostly brooches, I think.
I've noticed the brooch is becoming like...
The brooch is coming back.
Brooch is coming back for men.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, except for watches, I really never see women wearing men's rings or, I don't know what else, tie clips. I don't know.
I covet cufflinks. I want to wear it. I love cufflinks, yeah. I think we have time for one more, maybe two more questions. I'm not sure where we go ahead.
No,
And I'll get you.
talk about bling. I remember the collection of Gloria von Thurn and Taxis, the rows and rows of pearls. But this is a projection from her husband, who was gay. So
You want to talk into the microphone?
she had all this jewelry from his collection.
Then do we have one more question, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Thank you. Kind of to piggyback off of that, but I know you mentioned that even with engagement rings or, men displaying their wealth when women are wearing their jewelry, what are your thoughts on, nowadays I see more and more women purchasing jewelry for themselves and wearing it to display their own wealth and success?
I think that's great. And as a really, really short thing, there was a watch that I had long wanted. I always thought in my head that someone would give me that watch. I was not going to buy it for myself. And it was like 11 years later, my mom just said to me, she's like, you should buy it for yourself. And I did. So I don't need someone to give this to me. I'm going to get it for myself. So,
I agree. It definitely speaks to the times and women feeling a sense of independence and feeling less inclined to wait for someone to give them something. I walked into Pippin Jewelry a couple of years ago, and I was looking at these rings and just hoping someone would give it to me. And the gentleman said, or you could just buy it for yourself, and it's an engagement ring to yourself. So absolutely. Takes the guesswork out.
So before I close, if you just can't get enough of these people, I want you to know that, bless her heart, Kim has just opened a show yesterday evening at Parsons School of Design in the Sheila Johnston Design Center. Fashion and race, deconstructing ideas, reconstructing identities. It's not there long enough, so you need to get there before November 11th. Maya, it has an exhibition opening at the Met, Atea Nature and Divinity in Polynesia, which will be opening in November. You have a little longer, November 19th. You have a little longer. You have a little longer. That will be up for a year, almost a year at the Met. Siddhartha has just landed at the Peabody Essex, so we just have to wait and see.
Pray for me that I finish my dissertation on time. I
And
need to have it done in like 10 days.
We'll all do that for you. Thank you all so much for coming, and this has been a really interesting conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. I want to mention again, especially for anybody who came in late, that this has been live streamed. It will be up online. You can tell your friends, family about it, and your jeweler in case they need some tips about what's trending these days. I want to thank you for remembering Kim's exhibition, which I just noted myself last night. And this was fantastic, right? One more hand for our panel.